And that's not political. That's, I would say, it's practical and pragmatic to have it investigated, to find out what went wrong, and then to put pressure. But the international community, and here I think the UN needs to be much more outspoken, whether it's UNESCO or whether it's the UN Human Rights Council and others, are not open when all these killings takes place, and governments actually cover up for each other. So there needs to be, real attention drawn to this issue and mobilization. You've got to see protection as a spectrum. There's a continuation of protection from peacetime to conflict times and back again to peace times again. And unless you see that loop of human rights protection right throughout, it won't succeed in the long term. And that's where the advocacy point comes in, that we all have to push the same advocacy agenda.
I think my name is Bassioni, David Bassioni from UNICEF. The colleague from ICRC, I think you're right to say that we do not lack instruments, conventions, rules. It's the issue of compliance which is the issue. So how can we bring about greater compliance? And we've tried everything. I mean, denouncing, calling names and shame. They seem not to, yield the results that we want. Maybe ICC might help a little in the way it's going. But that's the question. The question is, what other options can we resort to bring about compliance? Let me share with you some of the things that are happening within the UN. I'm part of that group. After Algiers and after Baghdad, the UN has come to the conclusion that the blue flag is no longer a protection, and therefore targeting is going to be a way of life. It's also concluded that there can be no programs without security, and for that matter, no security without funding. So those are new philosophies that are going on, and therefore the UN has embarked on a major reform of the security sector. And some of the conclusions really that are important are that we have to do better risk analysis and better risk management and determine what we call acceptable level of risk, because we are not going to avoid it, we'll have to be there. And one other very important conclusion is that in the past we have always talked about when to leave. Now we're speaking of how to stay. And therefore, for the next foreseeable future, targeting is going to be a way of life. Staying on in dangerous and risky situations is going to be a way of life. And therefore, the question of acceptable risk. And that brings the onus on the leadership of organizations like Mr. Group here, that analysis will be done and brought up to the notice of, or to the attention of the heads of agencies, and they will have to decide on whether that particular operation warrants the deployment of people to serve or not. And when we talk about protection of humanitarians, let's not belabor the point that the beneficiaries themselves need protection. They do. But you are protecting humanitarian actors in order to protect, the people who need that protection. So that is quite important. The UN also realizes that it's not alone in the field. It has to work with NGOs. And recently an initiative has been relaunched. It's an old initiative. It's really the concept of saving lives together. So a group under the Interagency Standing Committee called the Steering Group on Security has been formed, and I'm part of that, I coordinate that, which is really to bring about closer collaboration in security between the UN and NGOs. And okay. I think that's
I want to pick up on something that you said earlier and ask you, George, about this. You just said that there's no security without funding, but I understand from you that you're having a bit of trouble. There's a delay in the disbursement of funds through the UN cluster system to the NGOs.
I don't know what the source of that information is, that there's a delay. You didn't hear that from me. Well, an acceptable level of risk is one that is as low as we can manage, but it's obviously not zero. We are in the 40 countries around the world where we're involved. There's a fairly high level of risk in all of them, and we have armed guards in none of them. We don't have armored vehicles, and that means that our baseline source of security is the acceptance by the populations among whom we work, but that is not absolute. We had the most dramatic loss of life we've ever had in our 75-year history. Just a year ago, August 13th in Afghanistan, where 4 of our colleagues were murdered, with the Taliban claiming credit for it. We obviously, all of our security protocols have been followed. As I said before, our staff is overwhelmingly Afghan. This murder was severely criticized in the Afghan community because of the fact that the workers involved in providing services to local villages. Obviously, it was an occasion for us to think seriously about whether or not to remain active in Afghanistan. We had concluded we would remain active, and we have done so, but it does underscore the seriousness of the risk involved.
You know, in my time as a UNHCR official, I served in some of these very dangerous situations, and I did so in the belief that the organizational leaders and the political leaders of the UN would take care to protect my life. And I think every staff person who goes out there expects that. And that's why I'd like to sort of follow up on what Mr. Bassiouni said with what happened in Gaza, where UN schools were attacked, UN lives were put at risk, civilian lives were put at risk, and the follow-up to that, I think, was not adequate by the UN. The investigation was narrowly limited only to schools. Many of us called on the UN Secretary General to expand the investigation to the civilian population in Gaza, who were exactly at the same risk as, you know, whether you were inside the school or you were outside the school, whether you were a civilian or whether you were a UN official. Now, I think the UN and the political leadership of the UN is under an obligation to speak out very loudly and clearly when lives are put at risk in that way. Now, what governments will do is the next step. But as the first step, the UN itself has to protect its people, because if the UN doesn't, who will? And in protecting its people, it's got to protect the people that the staff are meant there to protect. And I think Gaza is a bad example of you know, as a follow-up to Iraq and Algiers.
Well, just a few comments on acceptable risk, which is an extremely difficult topic. It invokes a number of difficult practical and ethical and almost philosophical questions. The ICRC, although we work on an acceptance-based approach, don't refrain from armed escorts at all times. There are times when we do use armed protection in order to carry out our operations. And it comes back to that, the risk analysis. It comes back to the simple equation that we probably all do on a daily basis of risk versus impact. You look at the level of risk that you're facing, which needs to be based on a sound analysis of the environment you're in. And then you look at what potential impact you can have. Nobody's willing to risk their lives to go to a meeting or to you know, make connections or whatever the case may be. But if there are 10,000 refugees without water and shelter, then maybe you're willing to accept a higher degree of risk. And in fact, if it's a really life-saving situation, the ICRC, for instance, we would be willing to accept armed escort or armed protection of our operations in order to save lives. That armed protection, though, there's a caveat to it, of course. Obviously, it would be protection against criminal activities. It wouldn't be for protection against the party of the conflict. Could be anyone. Possibly, yes. Well, which is exactly the point why. Well, which is exactly why the armed protection wouldn't be to guard against one of the parties of the conflict. That wouldn't work, obviously. When we do use armed protection, is to for. Yeah. Well, it might be perceived as that, which is why, in fact, being neutral